Quick note to our listeners, we need your help. We're close to 1 million views on YouTube, and we have over 5,000 subscribers. But if we can get to 10,000 subscribers by the end of this year, that will allow us to raise money for the Finding Genius Foundation and our study to help those suffering from anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Please just take a second and subscribe to the podcast. And if you can, like the video. That'll help us get more listeners. It'll help with the YouTube algorithm. And again, help us reach our goal of 10,000 subscribers and 1 million views. We're going to hit the 1 million views, it looks like, hopefully by May of 2022. But the 10,000 subscribers will be harder. That's going to take until the end of this year. Thank you.
Do you struggle with concentration? Have you ever thought of your brain health long term? Bowmar Nutrition is revolutionizing the nootropic and cognitive health industry with Sharp Nootropic Powder and patent-pending Bright Daily Capsules, powered by NeuroBloom. If you struggle with focusing, think of Sharp as brain food that supports concentration. Sharp works with your natural brain chemistry to provide a heightened sense of well-being that can delay cognitive decline and also increase mood. Bowmar Sharp tastes amazing and comes in many different flavors, available in caffeinated and non-caffeinated versions. While Sharp is a short-term aid in cognitive health, think of Bright Daily Capsules as a way to improve overall brain health and prevent cognitive decline long-term. As we age, so does our brain. Supplementing with Bright has the potential to delay this aging process and helps your brain function optimally. Stay ahead of the curve and order yours today at bowmarnutrition.com and save $5 off with code GENIUS5.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I have Jeff Miller. He's a political science and international relations person at the State University of New York at New Paltz. He's a professor there, part of the overall Department of Political Science and International Relations. So we're going to talk about his knowledge of ancient Greece, their political thought, and how that reflects on today. So Jeff, thank you for coming.
You're welcome. Good to be here.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background and how you got interested in political science and ancient Greece and all this stuff that you study now.
Well, that's a really long story. You say I'm in a political science department, and I am, but I'm a political theorist, which is a little bit different from your typical political scientist. My colleagues, they deal with the data and predictive side of things. I'm more of a political philosopher or historian of political thought. That's sort of where my space is, and I work on ancient Greek thought in particular, although I teach in all different areas. Most of my publications are on ancient Greece. And I've been very interested in the last couple of years about democratic theory in the ancient world. Now, how did I come to this? Well, that's a harder question. I'll just start off by saying that when I was a child, my grandmother would read to me stories from Herodotus, which kind of populated my imaginary when I was young, and made me think there was something really interesting about the ancient world and the Greeks in particular. When I went to college, I thought I wanted to go into politics. And in fact, when I graduated, I got my BA, I actually went and worked in Congress for a couple of years, and then decided I wanted to go back to the academy and studying political theory in a political science department, and mixing it with Greek seemed like a good combination for me. So that's been sort of my trajectory.
Yeah, before we move on, would you be okay, or was it too traumatic to talk about your days working for Congress, what that was like and what you noticed?
I was going to almost say that cured me of the desire to go into politics. It sort of did. I mean, you probably know a little bit about what working for a member of Congress is like. You have a boss, and your whatever sort of ideas you have, whatever sort of impulses you have are, of course, subordinated to that person, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it certainly wasn't where I discovered that I wanted to be. And I guess the really surprising thing for me was, I started out as a caseworker in a congressional office, and then was later a district director. And the member that I worked for was about 73, 74 when I was working for him. And I was just out of college. So I was a young kid in my 20s, had plenty of energy. But this guy, he would get up in the morning, and I'd take, if he was in the district, and I'd take him to a Chamber of Commerce breakfast meeting. Then we'd have a lunch date. Then we'd have several meetings in the afternoon. And then there was a reception in the evening. And, by 10 o'clock, I was exhausted. And this guy kept wanting to go. And that's,
Well, it sounds like you got all his food for free from all these
I got
breakfasts.
food for free, but I couldn't keep up with him, which is kind of an odd thing to say for a 22-year-old kid, right? Can't keep up with a 72-year-old. But I guess, working in politics and doing the sort of things that politicians have to do, I decided that wasn't sort of what I was interested in. And I was more interested in exploring kind of ideas. And so, graduate school back end. And that's how I made my choice.
Okay, and then how are you incorporating what happened in ancient Greece? Like, what are some of the interesting things you learned about their political process?
Well, I came into ancient Greece and Athens in the way that most people do, through myth. But then, when I was an undergraduate, I learned Greek, doubled majored as a classic student, and then I went on and studied more of it in graduate school. And it gradually occurred to me that, there's this whole world, of course, outside of the mythological context of ancient Greece. And, a lot of this philosophers are pretty familiar with. And one of the things I kind of came to realize, I'm embarrassed to say I came to realize it a little bit late, but maybe about a decade ago, I started to think about this. There's this, if you're familiar with 20th century political philosophy or just philosophy in general, there's this whole trend in the 20th century to turn back to the ancient world. So you can see this in people like Nietzsche, people like Heidegger, people like Michel Foucault or Giorgio Agamben. They all turn to Republican Rome, ancient Sparta, ancient Athens, and I guess there are antecedents to those guys even in people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But they all turn to the ancient world as a sort of corrective for the way that they think about politics or philosophy today. Now, this discourse is almost entirely conducted among philosophers, directed at other philosophers, directed at their ideas in a way, trying to recalibrate or reset the intellectual world that they inhabit. It gradually dawned on me that, there's this whole wealth of information there, but it's only the philosophers, only the historians that are kind of availing themselves of this. And, in Athens, in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, we have a very radical direct democracy that was very stable, lasted for almost 200 years, maybe a little bit more, depending on how you're going to measure it. And for real political examples of this, we don't have too many people that turn to that, right? So in philosophy, we turn to the ancient world, but in politics, we don't. So why is this a problem? It's not necessarily a problem, but it can be a way of addressing a set of problems. So if you think about, or the way I think about democratic theory today and ideas about democracy, and especially, of course, we're in the United States, so our democracy here as well. So I think about, the sorts of problems that we face, and I look at the sorts of solutions or ideas about how to fix them and see how they're proposed, and I find that there's a kind of a lack of imagination. So I think
one thing you mentioned that was really interesting is you said, like, in older cultures would look at even older cultures and what happened before, and it seems like today's politics has zero memory. Even 6 months before, it's completely different, and there's no looking back. And I would guess there's probably not much insight because no one looks back.
You're right. Americans are particularly notorious for this, and no more so than our politics. You can't remember from one election to the next, right? So if we do look back, we look at our own history. Maybe we look at the founding moments. Maybe we look at the Civil War, things like this. But it's a narrow scope. So it occurred to me, we have this vibrant democracy from 200 years ago. They faced a lot of the same problems that we face. They came up with very different solutions from the ones that we do. And they have a very different understanding of, both the nature of democracy itself and, of course, the relationship between citizens, the responsibilities of citizens, the duties of citizens. We can avail ourselves of these things. I mean, if you think about, if you ask the average person today, what's a democracy, the first thing they're probably going to go to are elections. And it's true, elections are important in democracy. But really interestingly, if you ask an ancient Greek across the board, whatever their political perspective, what elections were characteristic of, they would say, well, those are characteristics of oligarchies. Oligarchs and oligarchies have elections. Democracies don't do that, right? So right off the bat, sort of the first go-to for the average person about what democracy is kind of ruled out of court by the Athenians. They say, no, that's not characteristic of democracy. And, the reasons for this are pretty obvious, right? If you think about traditionally, right, who wins elections? Well, the wealthy, the powerful, the well-known. Elections pick out of the population people who are already powerful and put them into power. Their way of perpetuating power. That's the way the Greeks would have viewed it in brief, right? There's more to it than that. So they would kind of put that over on the oligarchic side, and they turn to other mechanisms for selecting public officials.
Just things coming to mind. Even the word democracy, I'm hearing in my head Democritus. I mean, was democracy literally a Greek word, and was there a person who was named something like that?
Yeah, there is a Greek philosopher named Democritus, but the name, the word democracy actually antedates Democritus, the person. He might have been named in honor of I don't know. I didn't talk to his parents. I don't know. Might have been named in honor of democracy. But democracy is actually almost a direct transliteration of the Greek, two words in Greek, demos, which means people, and kratos, which means power. So kind of a literal translation of democracy is people power. The term, we think we see the first instances of it really early on in the 5th century, maybe a little bit into the 6th century, but it seems to appear right around the same time Athenian democracy appears as a way of describing what's going on over and against more traditional forms of rule at that time, over and against oligarchies or over and against monarchies or tyrannies. It's a way of distinguishing this sort of new field.
Yeah, why would people say that elections are as part of an oligarchy? What is an oligarchy, and why are elections not, at least in ancient times, thought of as akin to democracy and how it works?
Yeah, oligarchy is another good Greek word, right? So oligos, the first part of it is few, and archos is rule over in this case. So it's rule by the few in sort of a literal sense. And for the Greeks, this is also, and for us too, right? It's usually not just the few, but the wealthy, rule by the wealthy. So what I said before is the Athenian democratic criticism of elections. Elections tend to result in the victories of people who are wealthy, people who are well-known, people who are powerful, people who are eristically or oratorically talented, especially in Athens, where everything's sort of a verbal society. So it's a way of kind of restricting, elections for the Greeks are a way of restricting power to a small set of people who already have some sort of influence in society. So in Athenian democracy, they viewed this as problematic because of their commitments to equality. So elections yielded a particular type of candidate, and not just a particular type of candidate, but a particular type of victor. And they wanted to spread political power more broadly across the demos, the people.
Okay. So what kind of solutions were envisioned in ancient Greece that worked or didn't work? What can we learn from it?
Yeah, well, there's a whole slew of different things. In the book Democracy in Crisis that just came out this year that I wrote, I sample a whole bunch of different ways in which Athenian democracy attempted to kind of articulate its values and spread its power. But I can focus on a couple of things here. Since we're talking about elections, the most obvious question, the first question, I say, Athens doesn't tend to use elections very much in the classical period. So how do they decide on their public officials? Because there are public officials in Athens, right? Athenians turned instead to this thing, the fancy name for it is sortition, but we would just call it a lottery, right? So the Athenians filled, we're not sure of the exact number, somewhere north of 1,100, so 1,100 positions every year, civic positions, on the basis of basically a lottery, on the basis of sortition. And these were all sorts of positions up and down the political architecture of Athens. So some of the most important positions, and then some lesser positions in Athens. So this means that any public official that you ran into in Athens was very likely to have been someone that was just selected by a lottery system. So, for example, in the port area of Athens, there was a group of officials that was in charge of making sure that the weights and measurements used for trade were consistent across the board and were fair. And they needed about 10 people to serve on this board. And so every year they'd select more or less at random 10 citizens, and they put them together on a board, and they say, okay, you guys are in charge of this, right? There's a group of people that are in charge of keeping the streets clean. There are groups of people that are in charge of various military activities, people that are in charge of various festivals, a whole series of these boards, usually made up of more than one person, probably 10, put together, working on a particular issue. So it's kind of startling, right? It's kind of like us opening a phone book up. I guess we really don't have phone books anymore, but imagine you had a phone book still and you opened it up and you said, okay, we need some town councilors, we need a superintendent of highways, we need, someone to oversee this grant program, whatever it is, and you land on a person at random and you pick them out of the pile and say, hey, guess what? Okay, this year you're going to do it. Very rarely would the Athenians put this sort of responsibility on one person. It was usually a group. This allowed for a little bit of leeway. Some citizens doing this sort of activity wouldn't necessarily know too much about it. Others would know a lot. Some would have connections. Some wouldn't. Some might be, really eager to participate. Maybe others have other concerns. And, you could always get sick, or just might be sort of a case of incompetence. But the fact that the board's made up of about 10 people means that the ground's going to be covered. So for this basic bureaucratic, we would think of it as kind of a bureaucratic infrastructure. We have this rotating group of citizens, each appointed for a year on a particular board, overseeing the basic aspects of the city. And then the main legislative body of Athens, the assembly, which is theoretically the meeting of all adult male citizens, but more likely probably about 6,000 people at any given meeting. This body is overseen by a group called the Council, the Boule in ancient Greece. And this is 500 people that are picked at random through a very complex process that makes representation on the Boule match the geographic, social, and demographic variety of Athens, makes them all represented on this board. This group of 500 people was sort of like the steering committee for the city. And then a smaller subcategory of that would have been in charge on a rotating basis, on a day-to-day basis, the activities of the city. And then one person, here's kind of the most astonishing thing, one person was the head of the council. Every day there was a new head of the council. And this person who was the head of the council was, of course, selected on the basis of a lottery. But it basically meant that for a day, this person was head of state. He was the person that, first greeted the ambassadors. He was the person that convened the council. He was the person that drove decision-making. One scholar, Mogens Hansen, a very famous Danish scholar, does some calculations, roughly back-of-the-envelope calculations, and suggests that at any given time, about a quarter of the Athenian citizens had served as head of state for a day.
Wow.
Right? That's astonishing. It's like a quarter of the Americans would have been president for a day. That's kind of the equivalent here. It's amazing.
What was learned from that? What was noticed?
What was learned from that? Well,
yes.
What can we learn from that? Yeah. So the first thing the first kind of response, and this was a response that some oligarchic or aristocratically minded Athenians or Greeks leveled at the Athenian democracy is, hey, you can't put just anybody in charge of these positions. They're not going to have the necessary competence to do this sort of work. What if they flub it, right? And this is sort of concern. So the first thing you can take away from this is that the Athenians actually, understood this problem. This is why they didn't appoint single people. They had boards. This is why, even boards rotated pretty quickly. Terms of office were only a year. That head of state business, that's only a day, right? So, there's a limit to how long you're going to serve. But it also shows that the Athenians really had a great deal of confidence in the ability of average citizens, in consultation with others, collectively, right, to do the business of the city. Now, I should note here, there were certain offices that they did not distribute on the basis of a lottery. So there are 10 generals every year in Athens, and those guys are elected every year, right? There are certain financial offices that seem to require some ability to, as you would expect, right, to keep a spreadsheet or, the ancient equivalent of that, some sort of statistical or numeracy. So those offices are elected. But, right, it's actually a relatively small number of offices that are elected in a year. Most offices, the Athenians think, well, the average guy, the average person can step in and do this. And if they don't know how to do it immediately, they can learn, right? So this is a great deal of confidence, placed on the average citizen. It's also a way for the Athenians to keep control of their government, right? If membership shifts from year to year, sometimes from day to day on these boards and these different magistracies, you don't have the sort of accreted power that tends to build up in bureaucracies, traditional bureaucracies and liberal democracies today, which tend to have their own institutional momentum, right? And they have their own interests over and against, the interests of the legislator.
Do you struggle with concentration? Have you ever thought of your brain health long term? Bowmar Nutrition is revolutionizing the nootropic and cognitive health industry with sharp nootropic powder and patent-pending bright daily capsules, powered by NeuroBloom. If you struggle with focusing, think of Sharp as brain food that supports concentration. Sharp works with your natural brain chemistry to provide a heightened sense of well-being that can delay cognitive decline and also increase mood. Bowmar Sharp tastes amazing and comes in many different flavors, available in caffeinated and non-caffeinated versions. While Sharp is a short-term aid in cognitive health, think of Bright Daily Capsules as a way to improve overall brain health and prevent cognitive decline long-term. As we age, so does our brain. Supplementing with Bright has the potential to delay this aging process and helps your brain function optimally. Stay ahead of the curve and order yours today at bowmarnutrition.com and save $5 off with code GENIUS5.
Well, I've been asking a few people I've spoken to about sortition. Are there any examples of corporations or governments that are using sortition with limited terms and, random selects and all that? And the answer so far has been no. But actually, you're saying from 2,000 years ago, it was yes. We just didn't know.
It was just 2,000 years ago, and it's actually, the answer is starting to be maybe, and let's try it today, which is I think the most shocking thing. So I have lots of different descriptions of lots of different Athenian institutions in my book, but the one that I'm most excited about and the one that I think has the best chances today is actually this idea of sortition. Now, none of the Athenian institutions, you can't just take them and drop them down in the United States for obvious reasons, right? They need to be kind of shaped for our particular time period. But the really interesting thing about this is that there are a number of communities in the world and in the United States in particular that are experimenting with lotteries, with sortitions. Usually these things are called citizen assemblies or mini publics. You might know that last November, I think it was, the city of Paris instituted the first standing citizens assembly in Europe. They meet together, they select citizens, 100 citizens every year. Those citizens meet together and they draft deliberations, or they have deliberations and they draft proposals, which then go on to the city council for a debate and vote. I was kind of excited just the other day because I just read that Petaluma, California, it's a town, Central California, about 60,000 people in it, just decided to institute a citizens assembly there. They designated $450,000 to pay for this. And they're going to get average citizens chosen by lot. This won't be citizens, this will be residents rather, chosen by lot to plan for the future uses of their municipal fairgrounds. There are other examples of this around the world. So there's Paris, there's Petaluma, right? There's a French national mini public that's been used to talk about climate. East Belgium has a very well-developed, pretty well-established citizens council. Newham, London, there were some experiments up in BC, British Columbia, with this about a decade ago. So I guess one of the things I would say about this is kind of an exciting way to think about breaking the legislative log jams we see in so many governing institutions where politics are so polarized and so difficult because of the structure of campaign donations and the influence of money, to shift things, that we have this new interest in just taking average people off the street, right? Having them sit down for a certain period of time, giving them a topic to come to some conclusions about. They consult experts, they bring experts in, they deliberate amongst themselves, and then they produce a document, which then goes on to, the constitutionally designated body to make a decision on this. I think this is a very exciting thing. So it's not sortition, lottery from the entire citizen population, right? Not every citizen participates, but it does have the kind of cross-sectional appeal that legislatures today do not.
Well, you have the perspective of the ancient and the current. So what can we learn? If I was to call you in to advise me on how to implement sortition for my company, let's say, what would you tell me based on what you learned from ancient Greece?
Well, I would say, in the modern world, it probably isn't practical to have every issue decided on the basis of sortition or a lottery. But I would think that I would recommend that anything that is particularly problematic, right, where there's a very, very difficult decision to be made, where there's a lot of influence being peddled by either side, a lot of money being spent on an issue. Really what you want to do is you want to kind of take that issue out of the pressure cooker that contemporary legislatures have found themselves in, and make a space where, people that are collected randomly can make some sort of decision about it. So, they're very helpful, I think, to deal with that kind of issue, some sort of big ticket issue.
How do you think it would work? Let's say, again, I had a credit union and, I wanted to have X number of the board members be people selected. They'd be asked beforehand, let's say. All the members would be asked, hey, this opportunity will come up. It's a one-term type thing to be on the board. It'll be paid. Mm-hmm. And in the future, we're going to randomly select. We want you to pre-approve that if we select, you'll consider it and you're willing to do it. And have you ever seen an organization, again, anywhere recently that has done this, where they're literally run by sortition? Their major positions, turn over every X, year or two, and they are all sortition based.
I haven't seen a major corporation, a major business, not that I know of, run entirely on those grounds. But I myself have served on our local credit union in this sort of capacity. I think they're required to have oversight boards, and those oversight boards are not generated randomly, but they ask for volunteers. But so here's the advantage to something like that, right? So often, if you get a bunch of guys, and I do mean this purposefully, guys that look like me. If you can't see me, I'm a white adult, 50-something male, right? We get into a room together and we talk to one another, and we often miss really important things that just aren't kind of on our radar. They're not on our horizon. They don't constitute part of our imaginary. And there are lots of sociological studies today that show that if you have a much more diverse group that's more reflective of the population that you find yourself in, or the constituents of a business, or the shareholders of a business, you'll have deliberations that are substantively different. And actually, there's a lot of evidence pointing to them being more efficacious, just in a strict, narrow, instrumental business sense, right? So this is just sort of a fancy way of saying representation and diversity actually seems to matter practically. It matters practically in terms of outcomes. And of course, it matters a lot in terms of the visibility of the business, the visibility of the political organization, right? Citizens need to see themselves mirrored in the institution that helps create legitimacy for it. So how do you get that? Well, it's hard to do, right? One way to do it, though, is through kind of a random selection. If you do a random selection, most of the time, your population on your citizen assembly or on your council, assuming it's large enough, is going to be roughly representative. It's going to roughly map onto the diversity of your local population. So these can be very helpful, both in a practical sense, in terms of the business, in terms of the quality of the laws, and it can also be helpful in the sense of enhancing the legitimacy of the institution.
What are some of the criteria for diversity that you've seen work versus just like platitudes? We have these different races, so therefore we're diverse. Like between meritocracy, if you could establish such a thing, and just the buzzword diversity, have you seen any organizations in terms of sortition have parameters that seem to be more useful than others?
Well, I should say I don't. I'm not aware of. There may be, and I might not be aware of them. I'm not aware of any businesses that make these decisions on the basis of sortition. So I mentioned that I'd served on my local credit union, but this was because probably like you, they sent around an invitation. They said, "Would you like to do this? Would you be interested if we select you?" And then they have an interview, and then they select you. So that's not really a random selection. I volunteer for it, right? So I'm self-selecting, and then I have to be interviewed. So there's some sort of criteria by which the interviewers are making their decision as well. So that's not really a random selection. The only places in government that I've seen this happen are some of these institutions that I've mentioned before in East Belgium or in Petaluma or in Paris, where it really is a random selection. So the way that they do that is most of these are not just citizens but residents. They survey a set number of people, depending on how big they want the citizens' assembly to be, and they survey a larger number of people and ask, "Would you be willing to do this?" And if the people respond, "Yes, I'd be willing to do it," then they put their name in the hopper, and they come up with a certain number of people who they ask if they actually participate. So that number should be high enough to actually ensure that the Citizens' Council or me public can be fully populated. But at that point, you have something that looks a little bit more like a random selection. And, in order to do this, you need to ensure that, some of the things that we often neglect in politics are taken care of, right? So not everybody can take the time to do this. Some people have children, some people have businesses or jobs. You think about the people who volunteer to run the elections. You walk into an electoral place, they're almost all retired, right? Because all these retired people, they have plenty of time. They're almost all middle class because they have the money and the leisure to kind of sit down and do this sort of thing. So in all of these mini publics that I mentioned, there are considerable efforts to make sure that the citizens who are doing this or the residents who are doing this have access to free childcare while they're doing it, get compensated to a certain extent to make it worth their time, so they can kind of give up on whatever they're doing, whatever time they're sacrificing, in terms of their work or their job or their real life career to do this sort of thing. So is there transportation for them? All these sort of sub rosa questions, right, are things that really need to be addressed if you're going to get a genuine random sample of the citizen body. I think it would be great if some corporations did this as well. It's very expensive to do it, of course, right? That the city of Petaluma, that's $500,000 they're going to spend, for one citizens assembly. It's not cheap.
But why is it expensive? Where does the big expense come from, and why couldn't it be optimized to be not expensive?
Well, some of it is from those things that I listed off, right? If you're going to have a bunch of people and provide childcare, if you're going to provide transportation, if you're going to give them some sort of stipend right off the bat, you've got an expense there. Then you have to, have a place for them. You have to rent a hall or have a space available to them. You have to give them coffee and maybe a little bit of food. You have to bring in external experts. One of the things about these citizens assemblies is that they bring in kind of academic or political experts to come in and talk with the mini public, to come in and talk with the Citizens Assembly and say, hey, this is what we think. Here's the way to think about it. You hear all these different views, and you have to pay those experts.
One thing you just mentioned, you said the experts will come in and they tell them how to think. I don't think you meant it exactly that way, but
yeah,
what are some of the dangers with this where that would happen? Where it would look like on the surface that things are random, but they're not at all. They're totally contrived.
Well, I guess the first thing that we would want to say about this, first, you're right. The experts don't tell them how to think, but they make a case. They say, here's what I think the facts show, right? And then the decision is left up to the mini public or the Citizens Assembly. I guess the first thing I would say about these, even with all of these sort of attempts to ensure a diverse, representative sample of the citizens or the residents in the area, you're never going to get a fully random sample. That seems to be beyond the realm of possibility. Some people just don't want to participate. And to a certain extent, even people who volunteer, they're a little bit self-selected as well. They're already maybe sort of interested in it. They might be already interested in politics. So you can never make sure that you can get a perfectly random sample. But compared to the state legislatures or the county governments, or certainly to the U.S. Congress, they are far more representative, far more, likely to map onto the reality of the population. So that is really the goal. You can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here, right? This is a substantial step forward.
Well, I was just asking, how do you prevent corruption in the sortition process where now it has the public image of being random and therefore better and citizens are involved, but because of the internal workings of it, it becomes corrupted where it's really, they're no more than shills for the existing puppet masters to keep things going the way they want.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, these are interesting questions, and they're important things to address. So, the first thing that you'd note about any of these citizens' assembly is that they're entirely public. Not that you can go and kind of sit there while they deliberate, but things will be recorded, right? The sessions are online. You can listen to what they're saying, right? So if you're an interested citizen or you have sort of the suspicion that things are skewed one way or the other, you can kind of zero in and see what's actually going on. More subtle things are sort of in the actual selection of experts that are brought in to speak, right? So this is actually a really tricky thing. How do you ensure that you get, a balance of the right kind of experts that also represents sort of the different views in the field? To do this, takes a little bit of careful deliberation and planning. So I think the idea here is that, if the process is totally transparent, right? If you can see that these guys aren't getting money, and it's usually too big of a group to corrupt in that sort of way anyway. If you can see that they're not interested in the institution as an institution, but interested in the issue, right, then that will build confidence or faith in the Citizens Assembly. Does it mean that any one person there won't be a shill for a particular industry? Probably not, right? But that person will only be one person out of 500 or however many there are.
Well, what are some of the elements that can be put in place to prevent corruption? Like, for instance, term limits, let's say, one term of, a certain amount of time for anyone and they cannot come back. Maybe that would mitigate some of the potential problems. Like, what do you think your studies would help?
That's the case with the Paris Citizens Assembly, right? It's a one-shot deal, right? They deliberate. and then they bring in another group, right? That's the same thing with East Belgium. So it's a shifting number of people, right? If you're not going to be in there forever, you're not this sort of target for bribery. And, the number, again, is too large to bribe in that sense. So you don't have sort of you don't develop these sort of institutional interests that members of Congress, members of assemblies, state assemblies, or, members of the bureaucracy get over time. In Athens itself, I think I told you, there's a very, very strict enforcement of time limits. Athens actually also had two other mechanisms by which they held public officials accountable. So they had kind of a preliminary interview and then a kind of an exit interview, right? So when you were selected by lottery, you didn't automatically get the seat. You had to come before a board of randomly selected citizens, of course, and they would ask you, are you a citizen? Are you in good standing? If your answers to those questions were yes, basically you're in, right? Afterwards, though, there's a more serious review of the work that you did. They held what's called a euthanae, which is a kind of a review. And any citizen of Athens that thought you'd behave badly during your term of office could come and bring a formal charge against you. And the board would decide whether that formal charge had merit and whether you needed to go to court. But this could be, a dangerous prospect for somebody who was seriously charged with a crime. So, they had these sort of checks on the front and back end as well in Athens. Now, to my knowledge, there's nothing like that in any of the citizens' assemblies that have been tried around the world. But I think the key thing is that the citizens' assemblies, at this point at least, don't have final say on things. So one of the reasons why the citizens' assembly is such an interesting workaround for contemporary liberal democracies is because they really are just a workaround of the traditional route of going through the legislature or going through the bureaucratic process for rules making, right? You circumvent that initial debate in the legislature. You have that debate done in the citizens' assembly, and then the results get sent to the constitutionally designated body that makes decisions. Now, that doesn't mean that the decisions of the citizens' assemblies are always adopted. In fact, sometimes they're voted down. But that's kind of, I guess, if you want to think about it as an additional check, that's an additional check on them.
So why did this disappear for 2,000 years, or did it? What happened to the wisdom of ancient Greece? Where did it go in regards to this? Did it die back then, or did it just get forgotten?
Sortition and lotteries in the Athenian way of doing it, died with the death of Athenian democracy in the last half of the 4th century. Athens was kind of absorbed into some much larger kingdoms first, and then empires, and then eventually, of course, as you probably know, into the Roman Empire. So government became more and more distant, and it certainly wasn't a democratic form of government. You see little instances of sortition popping up occasionally in the Italian city-states of the late medieval and early modern period. You see some instances where decision-making, where office holding, at least among elites, is distributed on the basis of lotteries. But there's not too much of this that happens beyond Athens itself. Lotteries kind of go the way of democracy. Democracy for a long time was kind of a hiss and a byword, right? Lots of people criticized Athenian democracy, both in the ancient world and all the way up to the modern period, as consisting of a government that was unable to rule effectively. They were they were inefficacious. They flip-flopped from day to day. They were subject to, flights of oratory. They were more interested in listening to speakers than making decisions. They were corrupt. There was this whole series of criticisms that were leveled against democracy. A lot of them are reducible to a lack of faith in average citizens to make decisions that are consequential for the state, or for the city in the case of Athens. So you see this even in the founding documents of the American Revolution, right? None of those guys are Democrats. They would have rejected the word. If they look to the ancient world at all, they look to the Roman Republic, kind of a mixed form of constitution, right? And they didn't want direct democracy. Direct democracy, even in the kind of limited form that we have it today, is a latecomer even to the U.S. Constitution. You see it gradually seeps in a little bit, but democracy has not been popular, and certainly lotteries haven't been popular, again, because of this sort of prejudice towards the better educated, prejudice towards the more elite classes, and allowing them to make the decisions.
What was there any wisdom on how to fire or get rid of anyone that really screwed?
There is.
Sortition.
Through sortition, no, right? So if you're on a board of magistrates in ancient Athens, and one of the guys on your board isn't really functioning well, you might be able to kind of push him out and do the work without him. But for cases of corruptions, except in really extraordinary cases, you'd wait for the board examination at the end, the euthanasia at the end. But, along these lines, the Athenians did have this kind of very unique way of dealing with people who did bad things or were dangerous for the democracy. And this is called ostracism. I have a whole chapter of this on this topic in my book. Ostracism, we know it today, just kind of push someone away. You don't talk with them. You can be ostracized from your family or from your religion or from your friends in society. But this term is actually a Greek term, and it comes from the Greek word for a piece of pottery, a broken piece of pottery on the ground, and ostrakon. Every year, the Athenians, at the beginning of the calendar year, would get together and they'd vote as to whether or not they wanted to have an ostracism. And the ostracism vote is the decision whether or not someone needs to be kicked out of Athens for a period of 10 years. It's a form of exile. And they'd pick up, if they voted for an ostracism, they'd have a second meeting about a month, 2 months later, and they'd pick up a pottery shard on the ground. Pots were the common way of transporting goods in the ancient world. So there are lots of these pottery shards on the ground, and they inscribe the name of the person they want ostracized. And I'm simplifying the process a little bit, but basically they all got together and they put the pottery shards in a big pile. And if there were a sufficient number of them, there's a little bit of debate about the number, probably about 6,000 people participate, then the winner, I'm using scare quotes here, the winner has to leave the city of Athens for 10 years. Now, it's really interesting, right? The people who are ostracized are not ostracized because they've broken a particular law. Athens had a court system to deal with lawbreakers. Ostracisms were for people who were so wealthy or so powerful that they warped the democratic space around them. The Athenians were saying to these people, hey, you haven't done anything illegal, but you're so powerful, you're so rich, you can't be part of a democracy. You prevent equality from being one of the primary outcomes. They say you haven't done anything wrong, but you have to take yourself and your property and your family, if you like, and you have to leave Athens for a period of 10 years. There's no penalty beyond that. You don't go to jail. You don't get a fine. Your family can stay, your estates, your land, whatever you have in Athens, that can all stay, but you have to leave for 10 years. And after 10 years, you can come back. We have instances of individuals who were ostracized once, spent 10 years out, returned, and then within a couple of years were ostracized again. These guys were like, right? But the basic message here again for these people is that, some forms of power are incompatible with democratic government. And it's striking that it does not require some sort of formal legal censure, right? You think about who gets ostracized, right? It's not the guy down the street. It's not your cousin. It's the person who's very wealthy, comes from an old noble family, has a lot of money, and has all of this influence. I mean, just, even if I wanted to vote against my neighbor and ostracize him, not enough people would do it as well, right? The people who win the ostracisms are the wealthy, are the powerful.
Gotcha. So what would be your dream test case for sortition, in today's modern age? Would it be a company? Would it be a local government? And what would it look like?
Well, my concerns are mostly with the government. I think companies, because of the rules about private property in the United States, would be a tougher thing to do. But I think that most state and larger forms of local municipalities could use effectively some form of citizens' assembly as an adjunct to their decision-making process. I'm kind of actually a little bit optimistic about this. I think, you know what we always say in American politics, right? The states are the laboratories of democracy, right? So we can see some cities and some states kind of dipping their toe into this realm of sortition to deal with sort of very difficult issues. And you can actually see sort of the attractiveness of this to more traditional lawmakers, right? Lawmakers who may not want to make a decision on a highly politicized issue, may want to punt a little bit and give it to somebody else, or give it to a citizens' assembly to give them a little cover for making the decision. You can see some motivation there on the part of more normal politicians to go along with this. I'm also optimistic about it because, it would be really hard to institute ostracism. Although I have to say, Donald Trump seemed to have been ostracized from Twitter. It was pretty effective ostracism, right? Cut off at the knees. And that's going to be a really hard thing to kind of mimic in American society. But I think sortition is something that we could realistically shoot for, even at the very, very local levels, right? If you have some sort of financial windfall, or you have some piece of property that the city is thinking about doing something with, well, instead of the city council making a decision about it, how about convening a board of citizens representative of everybody in the city, not just citizens, but residents across the board, and let them deliberate about it and make some recommendations.
Okay. Well, very good. What's the name of your book? Sounds very interesting. Where is it available? And I want to ask people how to get in touch with you as well.
Yeah, the book is called Democracy in Crisis, Lessons from Ancient Athens. The publisher is Imprint Academic, and it's this year. It came out in January. You can get it on all the normal places. You can get it at Amazon. You can go to your bookstore and order it there. And people are welcome to email me directly. I'm at millerj@newpaltz.edu. So that's my email address. They can, of course, contact me. I also have a web page. If they're interested in seeing that, they can look at my web page. It's a little more complex, but I'll speak it out for you. It's faculty.newpaltz.edu/Jeff Miller. And the college is New Paltz, NEWPALTZ. So you can see my website there, my blog page, and there are references to the book there, some other interviews I've given. You can go to the Amazon site and see the book itself. And take a look. Not just at my book, but take a look at citizens' assemblies and sortition more generally.
Excellent. Well, it's been a really cool call. I've been glad to speak to you, and thank you for coming. And I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks very much. Nice chatting with you, Richard. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Do you struggle with concentration? Have you ever thought of your brain health long term? Bowmar Nutrition is revolutionizing the nootropic and cognitive health industry with sharp nootropic powder and patent-pending bright daily capsules, powered by NeuroBloom. If you struggle with focusing, think of Sharp as brain food that supports concentration. Sharp works with your natural brain chemistry to provide a heightened sense of well-being that can delay cognitive decline and also increase mood. Bowmar Sharp tastes amazing and comes in many different flavors, available in caffeinated and non-caffeinated versions. While Sharp is a short-term aid in cognitive health, think of Bright Daily Capsules as a way to improve overall brain health and prevent cognitive decline long-term. As we age, so does our brain. Supplementing with Bright has the potential to delay this aging process and helps your brain function optimally. Stay ahead of the curve and order yours today at bowmarnutrition.com and save $5 off with code GENIUS5.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.